Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah White. I am Director of Operations at historic St. John's Church in Richmond, Virginia. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. John Ragosta. Dr. Ragosta is an historian, lawyer, and award-winning author. He has taught law and history at the University of Virginia, George Washington University, and at Oberlin, Randolph, and Hamilton College. He is currently a fellow at Virginia Humanities and a historian at Monticello. He also is a lecturer on an online course about Patrick Henry, the forgotten founding father. I'll put a link up so that you can check that out if you're interested, something fun to do while you're at home. He's also the author of this book that I will be referring to today called Patrick Henry, Proclaiming a Revolution. Hello, Dr. Ragosta.
Good afternoon, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for being here. So we're here today on September 17th because today is Constitution Day and also Citizenship Day. September 17th, 1787 being the date that the Constitution, maybe the rough draft, was presented to the citizens of the United States. Were they called the United States at that moment?
Sure, they were the United States, but you still didn't have the Constitution. It was under the Articles of Confederation.
That's right.
And that's the end of the Philadelphia Convention, September 17th.
Right. So how about we start with what's wrong with the Articles of Confederation?
Well, you know, Sarah, it's actually a very important question we don't think about because we've had the Constitution for over 200 years. We like the Constitution. It's considered part of America. But this period before the Constitution, after the American Revolution and before the Constitution, was very troubling to a lot of people, including Patrick Henry, because the government under the Articles of Confederation could not raise revenue. They had no taxing authority. They had to ask the states, please send us money. And by the mid-1780s, the states weren't sending money. And that meant the government could not pay back the soldiers who were still owed money, the farmers who had given resources to the Continental Army. They couldn't pay back France. The country was literally in default on its loans. No authority abroad. France and England were, and other countries in Europe, sort of laughing at America. And the states had started to take over and were passing a whole series of laws that were very troubling to a lot of people. Paper money laws, where the money was depreciating again, as it had during the Revolution. Laws delaying taxes so that even the states were having difficulties. So, and there's a great deal of economic turmoil. So people really said, you know, something needs to be done to create a government that has some ability to function like a real government.
Right. And there was also some issues coming up with Western expansion after the war. Mostly people from the South were heading west. Maybe we could use Western lands to pay those revolutionary soldiers, or maybe we could sell some of that land, but England was still out there, right, in the West, and we still had, of course, the First Nation, the Native Americans are there. So there's things we can't deal with.
You know, the Western expansion, you're right, is extremely important. Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people were pouring across the Appalachians, especially into Kentucky, some into Tennessee, some into what we know of as Ohio. And the Native Americans are not happy about this. There are going to be Native American wars. We don't even have the money to pay the soldiers in Pittsburgh who are supposed to be defending the frontier. You have England and Canada, and it's not exactly clear how far they're still occupying some of the forts in American territory.
Right.
You have Spain and New Orleans that eventually is going to block the Mississippi, so the farmers out west cannot send their wheat and corn and other goods down the Mississippi. So. But people, and I think you're alluding to this, people look at that differently. James Madison and George Washington say this is another example of why we need a stronger federal government. We need to be able to expand into this territory, which is our territory, and protect our people. initially, Patrick Henry tends to be of the same mindset, but then there's a proposal to enter into a new treaty with Spain
Right.
that would allow Spain to block the Mississippi River in return for granting some commercial concessions to New England merchants and shippers and bankers. And, Henry and other Southerners are outraged by this. They say, you're going to destroy. We have tens of thousands of Americans, mostly Southerners, but Americans who've gone across. They're part of our nation. If Spain is able to block the Mississippi River, and there's a proposed treaty to that effect, the Jay-Gardoqui Treaty, and it doesn't pass. But it doesn't pass. There's a majority of states that are in favor of the Jay-Gardoqui Treaty, but under the Articles of Confederation, you need 9 states for a treaty, and so the Southern states block Jay-Gardoqui, and it really changes. There are a few other things, but that treaty changes Patrick Henry's mindset. He starts to say, wait a minute, if we create a powerful federal government, are we going to have a situation where these distant people in New England are giving away the rights of the people in Kentucky and Tennessee? And Henry goes from being a supporter of the idea of increasing national power and creating a national government to being the leader of what becomes the Anti-Federalists.
Okay. So after that treaty, and that treaty that was 1785, is all during the same time that Madison is saying we cannot have the idea or the principle of sovereign states and have a national government. So we can't have both. How are we going to have both? And the Gardoqui Treaty was going to block these Western farmers from being able to send their goods down the Mississippi.
Right. We've seen, a lot of people talk about that, and it's sort of hard for us to imagine, but economically, it was much better if you're in Kentucky to ship your corn and your beef and your pork down through New Orleans, because you got rivers and, you put the stuff on boats,
Right.
versus trying to put it on pack horses and bring it back over the Appalachians. So, that if the Jay-Gardoqui Treaty had been adopted, there was real fear that this was going to starve the Western farmers out of any kind of economic participation. And people were talking about crazy things. I mean, the Spanish were talking about, well, maybe we should get all those Western farmers in Kentucky and Tennessee to join Spain.
Right. And there you go. You have possibly like the literal dissolution of what we just fought for.
Right. And so Henry's looking at that. There's talk of the Western farmers joining up with Britain that's in Canada, and Britain will support them to open the Mississippi River. So for people like Patrick Henry, this really is, there's concern that this is going to destroy the country if you create a powerful government that interferes, and this is the key, with local control of local issues. And, he's saying, look, this issue of the Mississippi is critical to Kentucky and Tennessee. It's of no concern to those people in New England. And so if the national government is able to control local communities on local issues, and Henry had been talking about this for ages. This was the Parsons cause, the first case in which Henry becomes famous. I mean, he's really talking about the problem is the king in England is interfering with our House of Burgesses at that time, Virginia's still a colony, on a local matter. So, Henry is not opposed to a national government controlling national issues, but he's very concerned about a national government controlling local issues.
Right. So this treaty is 1785, really turns Henry, really flips him the other direction. So then we get to Philadelphia. Madison, he gets Washington on board. He gets Benjamin Franklin on board, sort of the big stars to make sure that all the others will come to participate. When did it change from amending the Articles of Confederation into a whole new constitution?
Well, it very quickly. And of course, this is one of the things Henry complains about, that the nationalists, Madison, Washington, Franklin, but also Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, I mean, especially people who had fought in the war, because they recognized that the American Revolution was almost lost. because the Articles of Confederation had no authority, had no power, couldn't fund the war effort. So nationalists, led by Revolutionary War veterans, decide very early on that we really need a powerful national government. And so Madison shows up in Philadelphia at the convention that was supposed to amend the Articles. And as soon as they elect Washington president, that was the first order of business, Madison gets Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia, to stand up and introduce the Virginia Plan, which people immediately, I mean, people must have been, just struck, immediately realize this is not a minor amendment. They're proposing to create a whole new national government. And as you alluded to earlier, Madison makes it clear. He writes to Jefferson. He says, we tried a confederation of independent states in the Articles of Confederation. It didn't work. And so we need a national government. And of course, and it doesn't help that the Philadelphia Convention is secret. They make it clear that nobody's allowed to know what's going on. And so come September 17th, when suddenly this document is put forth, a lot of people are pretty shocked. Patrick Henry, right. Richard Henry,
including,
and saying, wait a minute, that's not what we expected. Henry, of course, had been elected to go to Philadelphia, but he doesn't go. And of course, we can't really read his mind. He says, I don't go because I've got financial problems. I need to earn a living. One suspects he also assumed that they were going to make minor amendments. But of course, that's not what happens.
Right. So he doesn't go. And then here he sees this Constitution through email on September 17th, I'm sure. And he's surprised, like many. So the first thing, of course, there's some complaints now that we need to get through. And this will all come up in the ratifying conventions. But the Bill of Rights,
right,
as we know it now. But basically, there are no explicit protections for individuals.
Right.
Is that?
And you talk about him learning about the convention and the Constitution. One of the first letters George Washington writes is to Patrick Henry and says, you're going to see this new Constitution. It's not exactly what any of us wanted, but the country's really in crisis. You need to support this, Governor Henry. And Henry writes back to Washington, because Henry has enormous respect for Washington. And he writes back and says, I'm not sure I can support this. But, the problems fall into two broad categories. You're right, the lack of a Bill of Rights. What we know of as the Bill of Rights isn't there. It's an amendment to the Constitution. And so Henry and George Mason, one of the leading anti-federalists, are saying, wait a minute, where's the protection for religious freedom, freedom of the press? But then, in many respects for Henry, the bigger problem is just the power of the federal government and how it's going to interfere with local and state authority. He famously says he's very concerned, for example, with the presidency. He says it squints towards monarchy. Henry is very good. He has a way with language, which, Thomas Jefferson is great with the pen as well. But Henry has a way with language that really appeals to the common man. They can understand what he's saying. So he says the Constitution's president squints towards monarchy. The president's going to be too powerful. He complains about the treaty power. He complains about the lack of representatives. He says, Virginia's going to get 10 representatives in this new Congress. He says, Virginia's the size of England. They've got 400 to 500 members of parliament representing the people of England. We're going to get 10. How are these people going to really represent local interests? So these concerns, which then become the two great themes of the anti-federalists, the lack of a Bill of Rights and the extensive power being given to the federal government, and the president, the treaty power, he complains about the treaty power. But those two themes are going to be the issues for them.
Another interesting aspect that isn't in your chapter, but I was curious exactly how this idea came out of the Constitution, is the idea of the nation becoming an empire. What is the whole purpose of government? It should be to protect our liberties only. It's not to make treaties with Spain that are going to interfere with me.
Right. No, Sarah, you're right. This is a very important point. I mean, we need to remember again. It's hard for us to comprehend. These people are attacking the Constitution. We love the Constitution,
Right.
but it was not at all clear that it was going to be ratified. In fact, most historians, I think, would say the majority of the American people were opposed to ratification. If you'd simply had a plebiscite and everybody voted, and the concerns. As you say, the substantive specific concerns, the Bill of Rights, the excessive power of the government. But there was also this philosophical issue of why do we have government? And Patrick Henry talks about this extensively in the Ratification Convention. And the idea of empire. Now, Alexander Hamilton, even George Washington, even Madison, these people are saying, the idea of an empire doesn't sound so bad. Thomas Jefferson talks about an empire of liberty. So we're not going to be an empire like that old British Empire, but we're going to have an empire of liberty. And that's not a bad thing. Well, Henry says, wait a minute. What do we want from our government? Do we really want a grand empire? And I was looking at my notes to find the quote, no matter whether a people be great, splendid, and powerful, if they enjoy freedom. So he really says, what is it we want the United States to be? Do we want it to be? Now, this question rings very true in the 20th century. Is the United States going to be the world's policeman?
Right.
And I say that with some hesitation because, of course, the world changes. Patrick Henry wasn't familiar with the Nazis and, fascism and all of these things. So, one can't make simplistic comparisons. But that fundamental philosophical question was very much on Henry's mind as he opposed ratification. Was what do we want out of this government? And he looks around and says, look, we're at peace. People live under their own vine and fig tree, to use a biblical allusion. Maybe we don't need to be a grand empire.
Right. And given that the Jay Guardici Treaty could have put our Western farmers in a position to have a conflict with Spain when we just recovered from a war, you could see where that idea would be actually very tangible.
Right. He's, we want to be farmers. We think of that idea of being Jeffersonian, but
right.
Henry certainly would have agreed. We're going to be a nation of farmers. If people can live at peace and have their living on their own property, maybe that's enough. Now again, in our world today, very different world. But he has this philosophical point that he's making. But it's the power, even that though relates to the specifics of the power of the federal government and the ability to have troops, as you say, the idea of the president as commander in chief, given all of the executive powers, very concerned about the powers of the president.
Okay, so we've got this background. Now let's come to Richmond. So, for better or for worse, now we have to try to ratify or oppose this Constitution. So in June of 1788, Patrick Henry, among others, is at the Virginia Ratifying Convention. So where actually was that held in Richmond?
Well, it was going to be in what they were using as the State House, but there wasn't enough room because this was the greatest show in town. I mean, people came to watch because here they're debating the future of the country, the future of Virginia. And so they moved to the new Academy, which is a building. It's no longer in existence. It had been built, and it was the biggest space that they could find. And so people were able to watch. There was approximately 160, I think, delegates, approximately 2 from each county, and then a few from some of the cities. And but people packed in, and especially to see Henry. Now you mentioned it's in June. I mean, that becomes important. And Henry had supported delaying the ratification convention until June. September 17th, Constitution comes out of the Philadelphia Convention. And Henry and other anti-federalists had this idea that if we wait, people are going to realize how many problems there are in this new Constitution. And Virginia is still at this time the largest, the biggest economically, the most populous state. he says, we'll be able to control whether it goes this way or that way, whether we amend the Constitution, what we're going to do. Hindsight tells us that was a mistake, because by the time Virginia meets, 8 states had already ratified, and under the Constitution you need 9.
Right.
And so everybody is saying, if we don't ratify this, we're going to get left behind. If we don't ratify this, George Washington can't be president. They'll elect someone else as president. So the delaying till June was a mistake. But if New York had not yet ratified,
right.
Rhode Island had rejected, North Carolina was waiting to see what Virginia did. So this Virginia ratification is still going to be very, very important. If Virginia refuses to ratify, and then New York follows suit, which almost certainly would have happened, how do you have a country when you have Virginia and New York, not part of the United States? Something would have had to be done. There would have had to have been a second convention or amendments, or something would have had to be done. So they all gather in Richmond and go to the new academy. And again, they say that the state government, at one point, the state government was supposed to be meeting the House of Delegates. They couldn't meet because everybody's over watching the ratification convention.
So they're at the convention. How long does it last? And are they there like Monday through Friday? Or is this like on the weekend only? Or
so this is Monday through Saturday. They're working
Monday
6
through
days
Saturday,
a week.
like 9 to 5? Or
boy, I should know. I should have a better answer to that question. They're there for about 3 to 4 weeks, and it's sort of a full day activity. Not until the end, as opposed to at the Constitutional Convention. And at Virginia's Constitutional Convention and so on, you had to send off committees to do work, to do drafting, to get this and that ready. That's really not happening here until the very end. And we get some committees, we could talk about that, to draft proposed amendments, to talk about how, if we ratify, what should the ratification say. But this is really keeping them busy. James Madison, who is the leading Federalist at the convention, is off and on ill, and he's very concerned because he's not able to come. And Henry, who speaks at the convention more than anybody, Henry is making speeches almost every day, going on at great length, really becomes sort of a dominant force at the ratification convention.
Okay, are they not going through each point of the new Constitution and voting on it?
No.
No.
They're supposed to. This actually became a big issue at the various ratification conventions, not just in Virginia, but in Massachusetts and so on. Should we debate the Constitution, the whole thing, or should we go article by article? And generally, the Federalists wanted to go article by article because then it becomes much harder to raise these very broad issues. But they agree in Virginia, they're going to go article by article, and it falls apart in the first day because Henry gets up and says, why are we forming this new powerful nation to create an empire? Liberty is what's important. And Henry gets up and starts saying, some of these very broad principled attacks. And, so the semblance of ordering, going article by article, clause by clause, it just falls apart from day one. And it really, it does move, the convention moves and sort of undulates from one broad issue to another. And the chairman of the convention, Pendleton is the chairman, he tries, he said, okay, today we're talking about Article 1, Section 8, but nobody pays any attention. They're going to debate what they think is important.
Okay, so, well, there's a couple famous parts of the convention. There's Thunder speech, and there's also a little bit about his ugly speech on slavery towards the end. Maybe we could just talk about those key points.
Well, actually, I would mention 3 specific things.
Okay.
They're debating, as you say, the Bill of Rights. George Mason, in particular, is very adamant about that. They're debating presidential powers and treaty powers. But it gets to the end, and they realize the vote's going to be very, very tight. But it begins to look like the Federalists are going to win the vote, and this concern about how can we stay out. And the Federalists basically offer, they say, look, and the same thing had happened in Massachusetts when it looked like the Federalists were going to lose. Let's ratify the Constitution, and then we'll adopt amendments. And you know, and Virginia will be a part of that. Virginia, if we adopt the Constitution, will send delegates to Congress and we can help with amendments. So it looks like ratification is going to pass. And three critical speeches. The one you allude to, Henry, and historians criticize him. He makes an ugly reference to slavery. It's not extended, but he basically says, you know, this new national government may interfere with our ownership of the slaves, and trying to appeal to that issue. Of course, the Constitution itself had been a compromise on slavery in many critical respects. But he makes that speech, it goes over with sort of a thud, and nothing much comes of it. Second, he makes the thunder speech that you refer to, and this is extraordinary. I mean, it's such great Henry. He knows he's losing, and he stands up. And again, I'm gonna look at my notes because I want to make sure I get some of his words. He's warning people that I see beyond the horizons that bind human eyes, and look at the final consummation of all human beings, and see those intelligent beings which inhabit the ethereal mansions. We have it in our power to secure the happiness of one half of the human race. Its adoption may involve the misery of the other hemisphere. So he's saying, look, this is extremely important. And not only is the world watching us, but these ethereal beings, you know, the spirits, God is watching us. The angels are watching us as we make this critical decision. And the happiness of the world is going to depend upon what we decide here today. Well, he's making this speech. It's an afternoon in the summer in Richmond, and anybody who's familiar with the summers in Virginia, you can get these very violent thunderstorms rolling off the Blue Ridge Mountains. So this thunderstorm breaks out, and people who are there say it's like Henry is calling down the thunder and lightning. He's calling on these ethereal beings. And Henry, who's, of course, the consummate, you know, speaker, he starts to use the thunder. It appears he's using this threat of ethereal beings. And people who are there talks about it sounds like he is calling down the thunder and lightning of God and of these ethereal beings to emphasize his points. You know, and warning people, this is a really critical issue. And then finally, Henry's final speech, the third, really, and I think the most important speech may be made in any one of the ratifying conventions, is Henry stands up on the last day and he says, you know I have taken up all of your time. He knows he's spoken more than anybody.
Right.
And he says, and I hope I haven't taken too much of your time. And I apologize if I've said anything that offends people. But then he says something critically important. And he says, you know, if I lose, if you ratify this convention, I will continue to seek to make amendments to control the power of the federal government, to protect those individual liberties, but I will do it in a constitutional way. Mm-hmm. There had already been rumors that the Anti-Federalists might become violent, might become sort of a fifth column against the new government. George Mason had made a speech the previous day that was heavily criticized by Henry Lee and Edmund Randolph as threatening the new government. You know, that we're going to be anarchists, we're going to oppose the government. And Henry's speech, critically important. He says, no, I will oppose what I believe to be an interference with our rights. I will oppose the excessive authority in a constitutional way. And, you know, that then comes back after the convention is over. You know, Henry is not an anarchist. You know, he says, I'm going to fight, but if I lose, and he says, you know, if I lose, I've fought the good fight. But then what happens is we know that the Constitution is ratified. Virginia agrees, like many other states, to propose a lot of amendments that should be considered. But George Mason, who had been the other leading Anti-Federalist, calls a meeting that night in Richmond of the Anti-Federalists to talk about what are we going to do next. And the details of this meeting are still rather obscure. We don't have a great deal of detail. And in fact, there's some question about what Henry said at this meeting. But I think, given that final speech that I was just referring to, Henry's role at this meeting is critically important. Mason apparently comes to the meeting with a proposal to be adopted And he says, well, this will be what we'll tell our constituents who don't like the Constitution. And everybody who read it said he was just stirring the pot. He was going to cause problems. It was going to cause, fiery opposition and violent opposition to the new federal government. And Henry comes in, and again, some historians disagree, but I think it's pretty clear. He says, go home. He says, go home. He says, I was there. I fought as hard as I could. We were all there. We did the right thing. We opposed this government. We lost in a fair vote. And now it's our obligation to seek to make amendments in a constitutional manner, to live under this government that was adopted by our fellow citizens. And so Henry makes this speech, and everybody does. They go home. And Virginia then is going to participate in the new government. And of course, we know George Washington becomes the president. We know the Bill of Rights are adopted. James Madison leads that effort. Madison, who had said we don't need any amendments, becomes convinced that no, maybe we do need some amendments.
Right.
And Henry always thought the Bill of Rights didn't go far enough. But he also thinks it's a very important thing. So Henry's message that, we're going to fight excessive government power, but we're going to do it at the ballot box. We're going to do it by sending our representatives to Congress. Critically important. And George Mason gets heavily criticized that, it's hard to imagine. I mean, there really could have been an enormous internal crisis if the Anti-Federalists had sort of gone up in arms and said, we're going to oppose the Constitution because we don't like it.
Right. So do you know where that meeting was? Was it in a tavern or in a hall?
I'm not sure where they held that meeting. I should know. It probably was a tavern. It may have been, actually, they may have held it in the Virginia House of Delegates.
Okay.
It was in the evening. The House was not meeting. Many of the delegates to the ratification convention were members of the House of Delegates. So I'm not 100% sure, but they hold this meeting, and it gets reported in the papers. It gets reported especially afterwards. And I say, there was some confusion about Henry's participation. Some people say, no, Henry was on Mason's side trying to stir up the pot. The people saying that are Federalists. They weren't at this meeting. They weren't invited. James Madison, and he never quite says Henry was supporting Mason, but he alludes to that at one point. I can assure you, James Madison was not at this meeting. People who were there and who were in a better position to know say, no, Henry was the one saying, we lost in a fair fight. And given that speech, the previous speech I was talking about, that's recorded. Right. We know what Henry said, and we know what he did when Mason had given the speech the previous day that suggested violent opposition to the Constitution. For Henry to stand up on the final day and say, look, I will be a peaceful citizen, was enormously important. The question, historians and political scientists refer to the question of a loyal opposition.
Right.
How in a democracy, in a republic, when you disagree with the government, maybe violently, or I shouldn't say violently, maybe very strongly, you think the government's doing the wrong thing. How do you oppose that? Today, we know how you're supposed to oppose that. You write op-eds, you sue if necessary in federal court, you go to the ballot box, you send representatives. But in the 1788, when we're just forming the nation, people really aren't sure of how that works. Can you oppose the government and yet be a loyal opposition? And that question is going to be debated throughout the 1790s, in effect, and a lot of tension in the Whiskey Rebellion and the Jay Treaty, the second Jay Treaty in 1795, the XYZ affair, the quasi-war with France. This question of, can you be a loyal opposition? And one of the things I'm working on now on my current book is that Patrick Henry really becomes a model for the idea of loyal opposition. I'm opposed to what you're doing, but I'm going to work within the system to try to make it right.
he reiterates that later in his life in one of his other famous speeches down at, was that in Charlotte County?
Yeah, the Charlotte Courthouse speech.
Charlotte Courthouse speech. Okay.
Right. But he actually, back up a little bit. I mean, in the 1790s, when, I mentioned that James Madison, after he's a Federalist and the Constitution's adopted, he begins to be concerned that this government's going to become too powerful. And Alexander Hamilton, shortly after the government's up and running, has his new fiscal plan, and we're going to have, assumption of state debts, and we're going to have the Bank of the United States, and we're going to have, this powerful federal government. And people start to say, well, wait a minute. And many people who had been Federalists are suddenly, starting to say, well, maybe Henry was right. Henry Lee, Light Horse Harry Lee, who had been a Federalist, he writes Madison and says, given what Alexander Hamilton's doing, Patrick Henry now seems like a prophet because this government's becoming too powerful. Henry at that time, 1790, is still in the Virginia House of Delegates. And he gets the Virginia House of Delegates to write and to basically file a remonstrance with the federal government saying the assumption of state debts and the Bank of the United States we believe to be unconstitutional. But it's just a remonstrance. He's saying, look, we think this is unconstitutional. We think our congressman should vote against it. We think the federal government needs to change its ways and change its policies. By the time you get to 1799 and the Charlotte Courthouse speech is after you've had the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Sedition Act basically making it illegal to criticize the Congress and the president. Today we would say clear violation of the First Amendment.
Right.
And Jefferson and Madison, who are now Democratic Republicans, they're now opposing Hamilton's and Adams' powerful federal government. Jefferson in particular drafts the Kentucky resolutions, which say, well, if the federal government exercises excessive authority, the states can nullify, and he uses that term, the states can nullify the federal action in their own states. So Kentucky is going to say the federal government cannot enforce these laws in the state of Kentucky. Well, of course, we have better hindsight because we know what happens. That idea of nullification becomes critical leading up to the Civil War. Right. South Carolina is talking about nullification. The states are independent sovereign authorities. We can remove ourselves from the Union. We can nullify federal action. We can ignore federal laws that we don't like. Well, this brings us the Civil War. Well, Jefferson is saying this in 1798. The states can nullify federal action. George Washington, who's in retirement at Mount Vernon, hoping he was going to have a peaceful retirement, he writes to Patrick Henry. Now, he hasn't talked to Patrick Henry probably for 10 years. He hasn't written to him for 4 or 5 years. He writes to Patrick Henry and says, Governor Henry, you need to come out of retirement. These people are going to destroy the government. They're going to destroy the Union that we fought for. These people being Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, by this idea of radical states' rights and ignoring federal authority. And, it's interesting. Patrick Henry had been asked throughout the 1790s, he was asked to come into the federal government. George Washington offered him to be a Supreme Court justice. Right. He was offered Secretary of State. He's offered ambassador to France. He's offered ambassador to Spain. Adams offers him ambassador to France. He's offered the Senate. He could be a senator. And he always says, no. I'm in retirement. I've got to take care of my family, and this is your government. Run it as best you can. In about 1795, he writes to Washington in what had been his final letter and says, I will only come out of retirement if the nation is at risk, if the country needs me or the nation is at risk. Well, Washington writes him in January 15th, 1799 and says, Henry, the nation's at risk. We're at risk of a civil war. And there was real fear that we were going to have a civil war. And Henry writes back in February of 1799 and says, I agree with everything you're saying, and I will come out of retirement. So Henry wins his election. Henry always wins his elections. But he gives this famous speech at Charlotte Courthouse. And, again, it's classic Henry. But the real message is, and he tells people, he says, I opposed this Constitution. I warned you that if we have this Constitution, the federal government was going to become too powerful and the federal government would interfere with your rights. But we voted for it. We, all of us, American citizens. And if you oppose the Constitution, you must do so in a constitutional way. You go to the ballot box, you elect new congressmen, you have them vote against this Alien and Sedition Act. And ultimately, I mean, the irony is that Thomas Jefferson wins the election of 1800, but he wins it in the manner that Henry said. Jefferson and Madison backed off this idea of nullification. Madison says, no, we weren't going to have states nullifying federal authority. And they go to the ballot box, and they win it at the ballot box. But of course, Patrick Henry is dead. Patrick Henry dies in June 1799. George Washington is dead. He dies in December of 1799. At the time and today, had Henry lived, Thomas Jefferson would not have been elected president, for a lot of reasons. But this Charlotte Courthouse speech is once again Patrick Henry making the point about being a loyal opposition. We're not anarchists. We don't ignore the federal government. We don't deny federal authority. We go to the ballot box and we send congressmen.
Was it the issue of nullification and that Kentucky resolve that prompted Washington to say we are at risk? Was literally that?
Right. I mean, this idea, and people were talking about it at the time, that if an individual state can say we're going to ignore these federal authorities, well, some other state says, well, we're going to ignore that federal rule. So, for example, the southern states had supported the slave acts that if slaves escaped to the north, they had to be returned. Well, what if the northern states try to ignore those? And of course, that becomes an issue in the 1850s. And so Washington is saying, and by the way, after the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, 10 states respond specifically to Kentucky and Virginia resolutions and say states do not have this authority. You're risking a civil war if each individual state gets to decide for itself which federal laws they're going to abide by. So this was really a great risk. I mean, Hamilton is saying, there's going to be a war if this goes on. And I'd say, Madison, especially in later life, says, no, of course that wasn't what we were talking about. But there was this great risk. And Henry talks about that. I said I would make one comment about his speech. He talks about it at the Charlotte Courthouse. And he warns people. He says, look, if you go down this route that Jefferson and Madison are saying, and of course he never mentions Jefferson and Madison, but everybody knows who he's talking about. He said, if you go down this route, what's going to happen? He says, if Virginia does not abide by these laws, he said, Virginia is to the federal government exactly the same way Charlotte County is to Virginia. If Charlotte County ignores Virginia laws, Virginia is going to send authority to enforce them. If Virginia ignores national laws, there will be a federal army led by George Washington that will come to Virginia to enforce these laws. And who is going to stand against George Washington, the great leader of our nation who brought us our independence, when he comes to enforce federal laws? Well, it's a Virginia election in the 1800s. People have been drinking because that's what they do at elections. And some drunk guy in the audience says, I will, he raises his hand and says, I'll oppose Washington. Henry seems to rise up and he turns on him, says, you dare not do it. The steel would fall from your lifeless arm in such an act of parricide, killing the father of our country. So again, Henry, he's one of the world's greatest speakers. People talk about this speech. He's ill. We know. Right. This is March. We know he's going to die in June from an intussusception, probably a bowel blockage related probably to stomach cancer. He's an ill man. He's an old man. People talk about him getting up. He seems bent. He seems old. He seems weak. But as he speaks, The blood comes back to his face, the power returns to his voice. And, this is one of the highlights of the speech, the steel would drop from your lifeless arm in such an act of parricide. He is the old Henry. But it's, again, today people are fond of recalling Patrick Henry saying, give me liberty and give me death. And obviously at St. John's, that's extremely important.
Right.
But people act as if that's the only thing that Patrick Henry ever said.
Right.
And here he is in the final campaign of his life, saying exactly what he had said in that final speech in the Virginia Ratification Convention, exactly what he had said in that meeting of the Anti-Federalists that night after the vote to ratify the Constitution, that look, we're all in this together. And even if I'm outvoted, I lost, but I lost in a fair vote. And the thing to do is to go to the ballot box. And if you want to change the laws, you change the laws in a constitutional way. So this is Henry's final performance.
Well, that seems like a great note on which to end our talk on the Constitution on Constitution Day.
Well, it's very good. It's the Constitution. It had its difficulties at that time. As I said, ratification was really in doubt. It's had its problems since then, and it's been amended a number of times. But the fundamental bargain of we the people, and Henry realized that. One of the reasons he was opposed to the Constitution, he said, look, when you create a we the people document, it's very powerful. But it was, we the people have come together and formed this Constitution, and we the people, it's our responsibility to keep it. And that's basically Henry's final gift to the country. This is how you be a loyal opposition. You support the Constitution and you vote.
Love it. Thank you very much, Dr. John Ragosta. I hope you all enjoyed this program. I will again put the link for this online class if you just want to learn a little more about the full life of Patrick Henry. And you have a new book coming out in...
I wish I knew.
Okay. I thought you had a date.
No, it's not. It's we're working on it, but it's really going to be focused on this final political campaign of Patrick Henry's, which is extraordinarily important. It's a little bit of Patrick Henry versus Thomas Jefferson,
Right.
but it's really mostly Patrick Henry. But we need to remember, the leading anti-federalist came out of retirement almost on his deathbed to defend the Constitution that he had opposed, because that was the right thing to do.
Right, because we the people voted for it.
Exactly.
Great. Thank you so much again. We really appreciate your time, and we also hope all of our viewers have enjoyed this as much as we have. So we'll see you soon, we hope.
Thank you, Sarah. Look forward to it.
Thank you.